focus on the state of speech in journalism, and as we're going to bring it a little bit closer to home to focus on speech on college campuses. So on my left, we have Spike Cohen, who's the 2020 Libertarian Party Vice Presidential candidate, libertarian activist, and founder of You Are the Power, a nonprofit who focuses on single-issue activism to empower people to work together and to restore individual rights. Next to him, we have Peter Boghossian. I spoke earlier, but just to reintroduce him, he's a philosopher and creator of the method of street epistemology, a prolific speaker and author of How to Have Impossible Conversations, and a manual for creating atheists. Probably not as good as the Bible, but great. On my right, we have Jason Sorens, fellow resident of New Hampshire, earning his PhD in political science from Yale. He did. He's taught at Dartmouth College, led the Center for Ethics and Society at St. Anselm's, and is now senior research faculty at AIER. Dr. Sorens founded the Free State Project in 2001. He's brought thousands of libertarians to the great state of New Hampshire, and we're all better for it. And next to him, we have Margaux Granath, 2021 graduate of the University of Minnesota, and former fire intern, now the fire program officer who focuses on their Student Defenders Initiative, which promotes due process on college campuses. Thank you all for coming. So just to start to set the stage, how bad do you think the state of campus speech is, or is it bad? And connected to that, is the situation different between students and faculty? I think we'll start with you, Jason, as a professor.
Sure, and let me see. That is on, I think. It's a great question. I think the state is pretty poor these days, and it hasn't been great for a long time, but I think it's gotten worse. It's almost impossible to talk about this question without engaging the whole debate over wokeness and the Great Awakening, right? And certainly I think the environment for speech got worse as a result of tendencies on the more far left to see speech as violence, to worry about microaggressions and safe spaces and things like that. And that resulted in a deterioration of the environment for legitimate speech. People talk now about how, well, maybe woke has peaked. I do see some indications of that. But this has been a problem actually for a really long time, going back before the 2010s and this real turn toward kind of social justice ideology. You could be canceled for your economic views for many years. I mean, how many here have had trouble in a class with a professor who's graded you down for your ideas? Has anyone had that? Okay, maybe, possibly suspect that it's the case. Okay, it looks like quite a few of you. Wow. And it definitely happened to me as well in the 1990s. So not in every class, not in most classes, but there was certainly one faculty member that would do that, and it was very obvious, right? And he would go on. I remember one rant in class, and I won't go on too long, but one rant in class, he said, libertarians believe that if you walk across a baby drowning in a puddle, it's perfectly all right for you to not rescue the child just because you're worried about getting wet. And I raised my hand. Actually, that's not the case. Many libertarians believe that there are additional moral obligations beyond just non-interference. But anyway, he was having none of it. So this has been a problem for a really long time. Now, a little bit of discrimination actually can make us stronger, I think. When you face that kind of opposition, it forces you to be a little bit better. You're encountering their arguments, and actually, I sometimes feel sorry for liberal students on campuses who don't get that kind of pushback and don't have the kind of requirement to hone their ideas and their arguments. So a little bit of discrimination is fine, but I think we're getting to a point now where students are self-censoring, and maybe Margaux will talk about some of FIRE's surveys here, so I won't preempt you on that. But I think there is some genuine concern here that students and faculty are self-censoring. I think it's actually probably a little bit worse for faculty because your livelihood is very much at stake in a very direct way. And I may have some anecdotes to tell later about this. I do think the institution of tenure should be protected because I know of too many cases where that has been critical to preserving faculty's independence from the kind of left of center norm that prevails on campus.
Yeah, so Margaux, if you, as a more recent graduate, want to talk about your individual experience, or not really working very well, or your work with FIRE.
Yeah, I can discuss both. Is that too loud? Oh, okay. As far as how bad the state of campus free speech is, it must be pretty bad if FIRE is still here. When they were founded in the late 90s, the whole purpose of it was okay, we're going to do this work for 10 years, we're going to work on litigation, maybe more advocacy of the First Amendment on campus, and then hopefully we'll be done. And that has not happened. We've continued to expand. And a part of that is the influx in college students who are promoting censorship. Whether or not they are promoting their own self-censorship, but they're kind of promoting this idea of safe spaces and wokeism and all that stuff that kind of can be hard to argue, not hard to argue against, but earlier, I would say in the early 2000s, it was students who were wanting more rights on campus. They were wanting to protest. They were wanting to have these types of discussions, and it was the administration who was, kind of cramping down on them. And now we're kind of seeing the reverse, where administrations can see the really poor effects of coddling and not promoting spaces with civil discourse, and now we're kind of in a really stuck position because it's tough to argue with students and say, well, actually your administrators are correct, or actually your professor is correct. It's much easier to say fight the power. As far as my own personal experiences, I am a graduate of the University of Minnesota. My senior year was in 2020, and there was a huge reckoning in Minneapolis, of all places. That was kind of the birth of the racial reckoning in 2020. And so to have any sort of counter opinion immediately labeled you as a racist. And I understand that. I understand, like, it was a very, very fearful time, and there was a lot of communities that it affected, and a lot of students were commuter students. This intimately affected their families and their own cities and stuff. So I don't want to say I wasn't empathetic to that, but it was probably one of the most contentious collegiate experiences ever. I mean, not to paint myself as the victim, but it was really hard to navigate, I will say that. And I think that looking back now at other policies and student government policies that the university has enacted and pushed forward, it is kind of swinging backwards. There was a lot of decisions and statements made in the heat of that emotion that have now kind of trickled back because we understand the consequences.
Yeah, just from Dartmouth's perspective, I think 2020 has been one of our difficult years, especially on campus. And Dartmouth students will remember the disappearings of Dartmouth students who flaunted university policies, but I think I agree there's something of a pendulum swinging back. So bring it over to you, Spike. I know with your activism with You Are the Power, have you seen any of that pendulum swing, or is the state of collegiate speech still not very good?
Yeah, so I think pretty much everything I can contribute on what the current state is going to be anecdotal. I believe the only panelist on here that never actually went to college. But part of why I didn't go to college, besides the fact that I was a major disciplinary problem, is that, and had to be homeschooled my remaining 2 years because they wouldn't let me in the Horry County public school system anymore, is because, and actually part of that is because when I would disagree with a teacher, that was not okay. And it was disagreeing with a teacher's perception or concept of what our ideas are. I wouldn't say that I called myself a libertarian at the time, when I was at this point 16, but I remember having a government and economics teacher who tried to explain laissez-faire economics, which interested me just because of what the name was. It was just an interesting sounding word to me, and I read into it and said, that sounds like it makes sense. Just let us, let the market decide things and let people make decisions for themselves and keep the government out of it as much as possible. And then when we actually got to the teacher explaining it, it didn't sound much different than you got to let the baby drown explanation. And when we were talking about it, and I disagreed with the teacher's assessment based on the book that she gave us and its explanation of it, that was not okay. And I can imagine that I was disagreeable in many other ways as well. But I can imagine that had I been in college, I would very much be saying the same thing you are. I can say again anecdotally that hearing from a lot of students, events I've done with SFL at college campuses across the country, hearing from students on social media and all of that, it does seem like if you say something that falls outside of basically somewhere left of, I'd say, Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden, and increasingly left of AOC or Rashida Tlaib, your words are violence and are actually doing immediate harm to the person who's hearing it, which apparently justifies them then actually using violence against you, or at the very least silencing you. And it seems like it's coming from both, in many cases, students and faculty. We've all seen videos of where different speakers, some of whom we may not even agree with, but because they fall outside of that very push to this side Overton window, they're shouted down and sometimes backed into corners by violent mobs of people. And then when it's time for the faculty to weigh in, they applaud the students for fighting back. The ones that are the mob, yeah, for fighting back. And so, again, anecdotally, it does seem that that's the case. And it's a big problem because universities are supposed to be the bastions of enlightenment. It's not supposed to just be, especially liberal arts college, it's not supposed to just be where you go to learn whatever the thing is to go do whatever job you're doing. It's to learn all different ideas. It's supposed to be a clash of ideas, but a peaceful and respectful one with as useful of a discourse as possible. So it does need to change.
Yeah, and on that, Dr. Boghossian, a lot of your work focuses on fostering more civil discourse and on people to understand each other with coming from different opinions. And so how do you see that a way to improve the state of college discourse, especially given a recent flare-up in tensions around the Israel-Hamas conflict and other sort of hot-button issues, if you will?
Yeah, I have somewhat of a heterodox view on this. I believe the entire system should be burned to the ground. I believe that we should encourage nobody to go to colleges and universities. And I actually really genuinely believe that. And we need to build new institutions. And I disagree about tenure. I think we need to completely rethink the tenure and promotion process and what constitutes that. So my solution is to opt out of the existing system and build new institutions like University of Austin, like Ralston, institutions that are based on free speech, open inquiry, and don't have tenure. I think that's the way to go.
Just on tenure, though, can't tenure function as a way to protect professors who are speaking, whose speech and opinions differ from the accepted mainstream, and can't it, in fact, foster a greater degree of independent thought and expression?
So that's a reasonable question. It's a good question. I guess my question to you in return, I never really bought that idea that you don't answer a question with a question, but have you seen that happen in the last 5 years? Have you seen tenured faculty members speaking? No, not really. What happens is through the process, huh? Say again?
Yeah, we have, there's a few professors at Dartmouth who do push back, I think, against the sort of the standard, stereotypical professorial
what percentage of professors fall within that category who have tenure?
Oh, it is rather small, but the few who do fall in that category, tenure protects them and allows them to speak out, even when perhaps their students would prefer them not to.
Okay, so let's accept by fiat that that's the case. What you have, so this is the way that I conceptualize the problem.
Tyler, I just turn it off and speak up.
That's fair.
Yeah, it is that the process of getting that, it's kind of like, if I may, Islam. It engenders a kind of submission. It engenders a kind of speak to the orthodoxy, bow to the orthodoxy. And if you do that long enough, you become a sheep.
Well, you, Dr. Sorens, just, you support tenure, so what's your perspective?
I mean, there are genuine trade-offs here, and if we had a system where entry of new colleges and universities were easy, certainly University of Austin is a good example of entry. We'll see if it succeeds. But we don't live in that. So in that kind of system, where you had competition, easy entry, lots of choice among colleges and universities, and a kind of an open labor market, you could have different institutions have kind of different perspectives on things, different administrations, different philosophies, and faculty could find appointments in a broad range of places. Unfortunately, there are very, very high barriers to entry in higher education, and there are many reasons for this. Some of it is accreditation, some of it is government funding, but some of it is also just the power of alumni networks and the things and prestige and the things that students want to have on graduating from a university. And so that's going to make it difficult to have that kind of free and open labor market where people can find a position in various places and don't have to worry so much about being completely shut out of the profession for their views. So I do think in the current system tenure is necessary, but tenure should not protect you from incompetence, and unfortunately too often it does, right? So universities do have the ability to fire tenured professors for cause. If you are not publishing anymore, if you're coming to class teaching from 20-year-old lecture notes or whatever, you should be fired. And we are capable of doing that now even with tenure. Unfortunately, universities have treated tenure almost like a life sinecure and allowed kind of deadwood to survive in a lot of these departments. So I do defend tenure, but it should be reformed in our system as it exists now. If we could blow it all up, then maybe we could do without tenure. But the way I see the higher ed landscape now, I fear it's going to be very, very difficult to blow it all up. And so we need tenure in that world at the second best.
Can we real quick check that your lapel mics are on over there?
Test, test, test.
Hi, hello everybody.
Test, test, test.
Pressed for time, but I have an example of this.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think if we fired every professor who used 20-year-old lecture notes, we'd have maybe a third of our professors left. Yeah, if you want to quickly deliver an anecdote, that's fine.
Yeah. So very quickly. So about a decade ago, I applied for a tenured job, and since I'm out of academia, I can just name the guilty. I have no compunction about that. At University of Massachusetts Lowell, and the dean wanted me, the chair of the department wanted me, the search committee chair wanted me. They had a couple of Marxists in the department who were like, over our dead bodies, we will not let you hire this person. And so the search committee chair called me and was like incredibly apologetic. I mean, they disrupted my teaching presentation. They did lots of things when I was there on campus. And they didn't hire me. They didn't hire anybody. But I later heard that I was telling this story to someone else a couple years later, like maybe 6 years later. And they said, they hired someone else the next year, a friend of mine who's like not a libertarian, but like a real right-wing conservative. And he went deep cover, got tenure, and then started speaking out. And these people in the department just like lost their minds that they had allowed this to happen. So, just one example of this happening. And maybe one reason we don't see a lot of people doing that is that there just aren't that many conservatives and libertarians in faculty to begin with.
Well, I just wanted to get your perspective, Margaux, as a more recent graduate. Have you found that you can learn from differing perspectives from your professors who have that safety to speak out, or do you think it allows professors to sort of give them more freedom to prevent their students from expressing different opinions and sort of enforce their own particular ideologies?
I think it can be both. I think, there can be benefits to knowing the perspective that your professor comes from, and that certainly aided me in coming to my own conclusions and participating in political discussions as a political science student. But I think that also it can negatively affect it if your professor is then going to waive your grades above your head, or cause academic punishments for not falling in line with what they believe. And so I think it comes down to the individual professor to promote a classroom that encourages critical thinking and encourages being aware of your own biases. And I'm not sure that every professor wants to do that or is capable of doing that. And for certain subjects, it might not be relevant, to be completely honest. I think it's relevant in humanities, but if you're studying computer science, I'm not sure knowing what your professor thinks about Israel and Palestine is really relevant to the curriculum. So
I've actually heard from students that were taking courses similar to like a computer science or something that their opinion on a hot button political subject shouldn't matter, but the professor made it clear that they were going to talk about it in class and everyone was going to agree with that professor about that. So it shouldn't matter, but I think unfortunately that it definitely does matter. Going to what Peter said about blowing it all up, I'm a big fan of blowing most things up. I will say one of the biggest problems that you have is this is a problem of regulatory capture where the government, starting in the 60s and 70s, introduced regulations that made the kind of pre-hiring practices and onboarding practices that most corporations use to make sure the people they were hiring actually knew what they were doing illegal and considered discrimination. Things like aptitude and IQ tests. And so they said, okay, well then now everyone has to have college degrees, because the colleges can put you through all of that, because that's education. And so now it's that, if you've ever wondered, why do I need a 4-year degree to do something that my grandparents could have done right out of high school? That's why. It's because they're not allowed, the people that want to employ you aren't allowed to do the kind of testing and onboarding procedures to make sure you're a good fit. So instead they make you go through the college system. So there's this artificial inflation of demand for having a 4-year degree that is a relatively recent phenomenon. I say relatively recent, the last, say, 50 years or so. That's a big part of the problem. So, I mean, big shocker that a libertarian saying government's the problem, but in this case, it is a big part of the problem. If we were to blow up the colleges, the employers would say, well, now how are we supposed to make sure our employees are any good? And that is a function of regulatory capture from government.
Well, on blowing up the universities, I mean, and Peter, Dr. Boghossian, you can join in on this. How exactly should we go about transitioning away from this, this sort of almost government mandated model? I mean, it seems like so many people kind of have to go through this model to get into the private sector, even to have a socially accepted career. Right, so I mean,
it's pretty,
how do you want to?
Pretty easy. You just don't hire people who have college degrees, and you start. No, I'm like totally serious. You guys are cracking up everything I say, but I'm actually really serious. And you take the worst offenders first. Harvard, Yale. You take the worst offenders first, and if people apply to those, that's how you do it financially. You have to do, and then already one of the things that you see is you see the alumni waking up. I wanted to piggyback off of something you said, which is an additional problem that you didn't mention, is that the accrediting system is basically a big cartel. Yep. It's a big cartel. So I don't think that this problem is particularly complicated, but I would like to throw out, the solutions to the problem is complicated. I'd like to throw out something else, not to muddy the already muddied waters, but I would argue that you cannot have both free speech on a college campus and diversity, equity, and inclusion. It doesn't matter if you have a tenured program out. Look at Charles Nagy from the University of Central Florida. The list goes on. It's been documented in some, Catherine Brodsky, and No Apologies from Pitchstone Press writes about that. Other people have written about it as well. And it doesn't protect you. Now, one of the things we see is Chris Rufo in the new college in Florida is trying to do that. He's trying to disassemble along with Ron DeSantis, just in Florida. So there are multiple solutions, potential solutions to this problem. Now, I will yield and I will completely admit what you said, that there's no question you're correct that the barriers to entry are extraordinarily high. But I would argue that that's not a reason to not have those barriers. That's not a reason to pursue those other outlets. I think you can think about it like a restaurant row. All of those alternative universities together in a row, together are not necessarily a bulwark against the derangement syndrome that's taken over the society and the universities, but it is an alternative for parents and students. I don't think that this problem is particularly difficult to solve. You see a person from Harvard, which is, if you, at some point, this is another can of worms, but Harvard's plagiarism scandal is simply astonishing. We have people who have, so this is the tenure thing, right? We have people, a non-trivial number of people have obtained their credentials through fraud. They cheated, they lied, they broke, not my rule, they broke an exit rule of the university. Yeah. Correct. Yeah. Are they fired? No. Claudine Gay retained her position for $900,000 a year. She should have lost her PhD. I mean, it's completely obvious. So the way you solve this problem is very interesting. You see certain names, certain colleges of the worst offender, and fire does an extraordinary, Greg Lukianoff does an extraordinary job of doing that. The second you see them, you don't hire them. That's it. Oh, and then you make one other demand. And that other demand is, if you plagiarize, I don't care what the color of your skin is, if you have cheated and obtain your credentials through fraud. Unless you fire those people, we're not going to hire your graduates. That's it. Pretty simple.
No. I wanted to something you said earlier, that you think that free speech and diversity, equity, and inclusion cannot coexist. So we talk a lot about, I mean, the assertion that that some speech can in fact suppress the ability of others to speak, and you mentioned Harvard is perhaps one of the worst offenders in this area. Do you think that colleges have that there is any merit to suppressing certain extremes of speech on college campuses, or should, or in fact, do you think that connected to the point about the particular focus on Harvard and other universities, do you think that there has to be an expectation that colleges have no restrictions on hate speech whatsoever, or any kind of student activism?
No, there's, and again, I just want to say Harvard isn't mine. Harvard is the number, correct me if I'm wrong, Margaux.
It's the lowest, yes,
Yeah,
on
it's the
our
lowest.
Okay, so that's one of the reasons I didn't just randomly pluck it, that and the plagiarism scandal. So I'm not harboring any particular animus against Harvard. So the problem, now I lost my train of thought. Oh, yeah, so hate speech. So I don't think that hate speech is a rather, I don't believe that there is such a thing as hate speech, or that it should be regulated. I'd be willing to entertain arguments that if the speech is a direct and clear incitement to violence, it should be disallowed on campus. Look, let's speak plainly about the problem. We have a bunch of people who have jobs for life. Almost universally, these people not only have mediocre minds, but they're cheaters and liars, and we know this. We know this because we know that we look at their dissertations. We know this. This is an empirical claim that's borne out over and over again, so this is not a radical statement. So these people are influencing, they've managed to embed themselves in university architecture, bypassing traditional academic structures where they report directly to the president of the university. Their ideology is replicated throughout the system, and which we haven't talked about, which we, piggybacking off of what you said before, yeah, it's replicated in the curriculum for teaching K through 12 instruction. So those people who retain their certificates go up. So the raison d'etre of those institutions, the raison d'etre of the administrative cadre of apparatchiks that defends those positions, is precisely to limit your speech. That is exactly what their purpose is. So again, I don't see how every time I hear someone say, oh, we're gonna, free speech, or we're gonna make these changes, okay, as long as you have, if you really want to show me that you're serious about these changes, fire the people who have plagiarized, get rid of the DEI boards, then we're ready. Oh, you want to know what a litmus test is? Here's a litmus test. You want to see if Dartmouth has free speech? It's not Peter Boghossian coming here. Invite Charles Murray here.
We hosted him virtually several years ago.
Okay, well, have him come in, see what happens, like at Middlebury. Have him come in. All this stuff Claudine Gay and these folks say, yes, okay, great. That's the litmus test.
Going back to the point about tenure and your sort of support of that, at least as a concept, right? Do you see any, when we're talking about tearing down these institutions of higher education, do you see any risk of perhaps going too far in a direction, right, and removing professors who have expressed opinions and have the rather perhaps even extreme opinions, right, but still perhaps removing them for in our search to sort of reform higher education and improve it? Do you see any risk of sort of going too far in the other direction and perhaps scaring professors from away from expressing their own views, almost doing what we accuse the left of doing to students, but perhaps doing that to professors?
Yeah, no, I'm all on board with scrapping DEI, but we should be aware that the threat to academic freedom doesn't just come from the left. Google Steven Salaita and see what happened to him. I don't defend his speech at all. I vehemently disagree with it, but he lost a job offer for extramural speech. That's what it was, and he's still out of academia as far as I know. So there are definitely threats. Even Chris Rufo. I mean, we could debate this, but the new college fired a professor for basically speaking up against their plans for the university. Now, you may have some, maybe you need some sort of discipline among your employees that they're not actively working against the institution that employs them. But nevertheless, that's a real area of concern that we could get this from the right as well. Now, I'm worried about it a little bit less from the right because academia is so overwhelmingly left-wing. So if you have a few state university systems out there, Indiana just basically abolished tenure, heavily modified it. Let's say Indiana then tries to cultivate a conservative university system. That doesn't worry me so much because it's one state out of 50, right? There are 49 left-wing university systems out there right now. But we should be aware that, yes, the threat could come from the right as well as from the left. And what we don't want, what we should not do is make the university a battleground for the culture war, where it becomes all about power and not about our mission of seeking truth.
Can I just comment on that real quick?
Sure.
So, I agree with you, the problems on the right. And again, FIRE has some great stuff about the percentage of cancellations and disinvitations, and correct me if I'm wrong, Margaux, but they tend to be from the left on campus and outside from the right. That's what Greg told me last time I spoke with him.
Like the students who are on the left are canceling and disinviting speakers who are on the right?
Well, the majority of cancellations by the right come from people not on campus.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so, and then the second point you made about creating a conservative university, states have no business in creating, they shouldn't be left-wing or right-wing, they have no business in creating any, they should be completely outside the game of ideology.
No, I
Yeah.
Yeah. No, our enterprise should not be an ideological enterprise in
Correct.
the university. But politicians are going to be tempted to do that, to make it that.
Right.
And if a conservative state does it, I disagree with it, I oppose it, but at the same time, I think the threat is less from the right just because they are so outnumbered on campus right now.
Could I? Oh.
Yeah,
Could you make the argument that having this sort of battleground of extremism is actually part of the university's truth-seeking mission, as long as the university isn't making a statement on it of itself?
Yeah, well, and as long as politicians aren't treating the university itself as a football,
Yeah.
right? Like if it's coming up, bottom up from the students, I actually like that. I like student activism. I like students feeling free to be radicals, actually, on campus. If you're going to have a time in life when you can be radical and just, explore ideas, now's the time. Like, I was briefly an anarchist when I was in college, and then, it was fun. Maybe some of you here are too. And this is the time to explore that, but it's got to be kind of that bottom-up grassroots, and students should be protected in pursuing those ideas and expressing themselves and not fear punishment for expression of their ideas. Now, if you're invading and occupying the president's office, as happened when I was teaching here, you should be punished for that, but that's not speech, right? That's when you cross the line into aggression.
Yes.
Just, may I comment on it real quick?
yeah, sure.
To a bunch of crazy woke people running around who've captured our institutions is not to make crazy right-wing maniacs who go around and attempt to cancel institutions. The solution to left-wing lunacy is not to create right-wing lunatics. So the state has no business in the ideology of the university whatsoever.
And what Peter just said, that applies everywhere. We're talking specifically on campus, but we're actually seeing this dynamic where the fact that right now it is the left that is the establishment, for lack of a better word, is leading to this creation of this, in one way good, increasingly dissident, but also increasingly extreme and increasingly authoritarian right,
Yeah.
which a lot of people will say, well, they're not authoritarian. No, they're not in power.
Correct.
Look at what they're proposing.
Correct.
Yeah.
You don't want that either, and that would apply here as well.
Absolutely. Great point.
On your point about focusing on students, we talked a lot about censorship from universities and actions by professors, right? But correct me if I'm wrong, but at least in Dartmouth, FIRE's rating of Dartmouth in particular, a lot of the points Dartmouth lost were because of perceived self-censorship by students because of again perceived perceptions of how their peers and their classmates would view their own speech and how speaking out would affect their social standing and their peers' opinion of them. So it seems that perhaps the students themselves are just as dangerous as the professors and as the institution. So how do you propose to improve that aspect of campus speech?
Absolutely, that is a big question. To your point, and Nadine talked about this morning, is FIRE does a campus survey of over 240 campuses, and we through Campus Pulse, and they survey 55,000 students on how free they feel on campus with regards to free expression. And so in our most recent 2024 survey, the amount of students who said that they felt nervous or censored themselves when it comes to speaking about controversial topics increased. So more than half of students now feel like they cannot express themselves about controversial topics. FIRE defines those topics as abortion, climate change, racism, the whole type of gamut. As far as how do we fix that, I would want there to be, you would have to somehow eliminate the consequences for certain types of opinions. And so in a classroom setting, you can eliminate the consequences of saying your real views if you say it in a hypothetical, or I'm just playing devil's advocate, or I'm just doing those things. But if you're at a party, or if you are rushing into Greek life, or if you're doing something like that, the social consequences of having the wrong opinion can be really severe. And we're humans, so I'm not really sure how we would amend those social consequences. I think from my point of view, I would want to be the type of friend or be the type of person that's open and willing to be friends with people who have different opinions from me, but that I personally don't have the amount of social capital to ensure that you can immediately get into this house or immediately get into this friend group. I think that's really, really tricky for students, and truly the only way is to make students more accepting and less fearful of social consequences. But we live in this world now where what you say on Facebook or what can be recorded at a party or on Snapchat can now have real world consequences on what jobs you get and who's going to hire you and your future in academia and things like that. And so it's scary because it is. And we would have to have a real change in our mindset on how we approach people who have different views and things like that in order to eliminate those types of consequences.
Yeah, it seems like there could be a tension between freedom of association, right? I mean, you have a right
Exactly.
to not be friends with someone who says, for any reason or no reason at all, of course. But at the same time, we don't want to use sort of, I guess, soft censorship and prevent people from expressing themselves.
Right.
Yeah, and Margaux, that's what I was going to ask. Do you know, or has there been any work by FIRE that's been done to try to figure out what percentage or how much of that is the actual fear of punishment or even just being reduced in your grades by the faculty or by the professors versus just social shaming? And the reason I ask that is because while I may not agree with the type of social shaming that's being done, and while I think that the cancel culture idea of you have sinned, there is no salvation, it doesn't matter if you apologize, you're bad forever, is wrong, I do think that social shaming is something that is what has allowed, I mean, that's part of us being social primates, is we use that as social shaming allows us not to have authoritarianism because it's our way of regulating ourselves and one another. I wouldn't want anyone in my social circles who's saying, slavery was good, or the victims of the Holodomor or the Mao's Great Leap Forward were kulaks who deserved it. But they're free to say that without punishment. I just don't want to be around them. So have you done any kind of figuring out what percentage is one person?
That's a really good distinction between punishment and then social shame, and I think that that's something that I wasn't very eloquent on when I was speaking. As far as what FIRE has done, we ask students about their own fear, but I don't think we have chronicled whether or not they're fearful of punishment by professors or fearful of punishment from shame. Anecdotally, I work in student outreach, so I meet with students every single day who tell me their fear is social. It's social based. Okay. There's a less fear of professors, and that's also self-selecting. The students who come to FIRE who work with me are going to have that type of experience. I imagine the average student on campus who isn't aware of this type of work and wouldn't necessarily come to this conference might feel like, yeah, I can't really be a right-winger, but why would that matter if I don't even have those opinions anyways? That sort of thing. As far as social shame, I think you're right in that point. There's types of viewpoints that I wouldn't want in my social circles as well, and I think that's for everyone here. It allows us to deduce who might be a harm, who might be a threat, who might be a potential mate, things like that. Yeah. And the difference is when 10,000 years ago when we were trying to like living in the caveman era, we didn't have Facebook receipts from 12 years ago. And so I would hope that what we are going to now, and now that we live in the age of the internet, that's still going to exist. We're still going to be tribal. And hopefully that can come with some sort of grace and forgiveness. And so what someone posts on Facebook, you know, when they're 15 and maybe they said something truly heinous, that doesn't define them for the rest of their lives. But that's what we're seeing.
Okay.
Yeah, we have to move on to questions quickly, but.
Yeah, I mean, I'd sort of like to get back to John Stuart Mill's idea that that free speech is not just freedom from government punishment, but also severe social sanctions. So if you're completely ostracized or fired for your speech, then you're not really free. And I'm a libertarian. I don't think it should be illegal in the private sector to fire someone for speech, but nevertheless, it is a bad thing to do because it does infringe on people's sense of freedom. You're not free not to be criticized. You don't have a right not to be criticized.
Right.
But I do think that it is wrong to intentionally punish people for their speech.
If there's any last points before we move on to audience questions? All right. Great. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I want to say that first question as to her is the real issue social ostracism and social pressure, or is it the fact that college kids are not really taught basic logic, so they tend to do a lot of labeling? You might not say a racist thing. We might just say reparations are bad, and someone might call you racist. Or from the right-wing side, you might just say, I'm pro-choice, and they will call you a woke feminist. So I feel like the main issue is not social ostracism, but the social ostracism are done based on irrational grounds. And so do you think that's the real issue? And my second question is to Jason Sorens. You just made the claim that it's bad to socially ostracize, but you're ostracizing a weave that we should socially ostracize others. So don't you think this is inherently contradictory? So you're telling people to not socially ostracize and they shouldn't engage in conflict, and they should let everyone to have, you know, a place to speak, and we should, you know, listen to others, but at the same time, this is actually kind of imposing your own view to others where how they're ought to act.
Yeah, I haven't thought about whether we should ostracize the ostracizers, but I don't think it's necessarily a contradiction. Like, we do think that we can jail the kidnappers, right? We can kidnap the kidnappers, and that is exercising self-defense. So I'm not saying, I'm not committing myself here, but I don't see that as necessarily contradictory to ostracize ostracizers.
To your first question, I think you're absolutely right. I think we're seeing a lack of critical thinking, and specifically critical thinking when it comes to media and how to have healthy and robust arguments. And I think that also goes along with the level of social shame. I mean, go on any internet forum, go on Yik Yak, go on anything that is anonymous by nature, and one person might say, you know what, I mean, I have Republicans in my family, so I don't necessarily think that all Trump supporters are bad people. And then the next comment will be like, oh, okay, so like it's okay to genocide then? Got it. You know, you're gonna I mean, it's that exists in every single online forum. It exists on college campuses. We're not teaching kids how to have debates, and we're not teaching kids proper media literacy. And a part of that, I think that's just, we haven't caught up yet. We haven't caught up with the time, and we haven't caught up with like the new wave of information and how we're talking and what that means over social media and things like that. But I think it definitely decreases rational arguments and definitely leads to people's social shaming.
And I also wonder, and I'll be the middle-aged man saying the kids are too soft, but I wonder how much is the lack of rigidity. And I won't put this on just your generation. Thanks to social media, we are increasingly addicted to the dopamine that comes from people agreeing with us and telling us how great we are. And I wonder how much of it is we're becoming less and less able to have someone vociferously disagree with us vocally. And like literally, oh, I've been canceled, they called me racist. Well, okay, maybe they're wrong that you're racist, maybe they're right, but they called you racist. Okay, so tell them why you're not, or, you know, go talk to someone else, or ignore it, or laugh at them, you know, haha, react their comment, or make a meme about how dumb that was, or whatever. Like, however you want to cope or process with that. I just wonder how much of this is we're all just getting so used to, like, feeling good because everyone likes us, that when someone doesn't or says something bad, we go, oh, this is the worst thing that could I've been socially shamed, and it's like, no, they just said you were wrong and maybe used some mean words in doing so. I wonder how much of it is that.
I think that is a really good point, and as someone who was raised in the generation, like I had a phone in high school, Snapchat, things like that.
Yeah.
And there's a certain element of like, cyberbullying isn't real bullying because you can just shut your phone off, or you can just shut the computer, which I've heard. And that would make sense if everyone else wasn't also online.
It
and
made sense when I was online
Yes.
on a dial-up connection on AOL
Exactly.
as a teenager.
Yeah, you can log out of the chat room. It's not the end of the world because
Didn't
there
matter.
was still social things that happened in the real world.
Yep.
And I'm not that it isn't real, but you get my point. Whereas is now, like, if you are, you know, if you're a 15-year-old girl and you're slut-shamed online, or someone is saying something to you, that feels real because everyone at school will know about it, and they have receipts, and they have screenshots. And so all of a sudden, what could have just been, you know, someone stealing your lunch money 10 or 20 years ago is now this urgent thing. And I think that is really scary.
Yep.
So I think there is less resiliency because we're so used to this like dopamine hits, but I also think that sometimes the consequences can be even more severe.
The difference between 100,000 people saying we love you and 100,000 people saying we hate you.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
That's fair.
Questions? Yes.
How does the dual role of the university, both as a place where the humanities are taught and also as a technical training center for jobs that actually require years of technical instruction, complicate the issue of free speech and reform of the universities?
And just to restate the question, just for the video, how just correct me if I'm wrong. How does the university having two roles, both as for research and for education, how does that complicate the issue of speech?
Well, not
Humanities.
research,
Humanities and
humanities and
yes.
technical education.
Yeah.
Education, yes.
I'm going to defer to everyone else because I didn't even go to college. So.
I mean, I have some views on this. I mean, I think colleges like Dartmouth should be fundamentally about the ideas. And, you know, the byproduct of training you for a career is nice. But I do agree with Peter that most of the value of a college education is signaling. It's not, you know, it's not that you're learning on-the-job stuff, maybe in some of the STEM fields. So one of the problems, I think, is that we have moved to a system where our students expect that dual role. In fact, most students are doing it purely for the credential, or overwhelmingly for the credential. And so they're not expecting that this is going to be a place where, actually this is about a search for truth and meaning and thinking about the bigger things, right? That is not what they expect coming to campus. And so we need to maybe even divide, you know, the way a lot of European countries do, where you have technical universities and you have liberal arts colleges, and never the twain shall meet.
Yeah, and perhaps that plays into the earlier point about, you know, you kind of have to have a college education, you have to have that certificate to get a job at all, because of the sort of government mandated market saturation, perhaps, and the only certificate that corporations can demand now is a college degree. They can't do any of their own evaluation, really,
or any effective ones.
Yeah, Spike, who was making that
yes.
point more. Yeah.
Real quick, my response to that would be, one primary concern would be when the values of the humanities steep into STEM. So, for example, we only need to hire this percentage of people with exogenous characteristics in the promotion and tenure basket, or we need to look at these basically make-believe values like equity that we're going to import. Beside that, there seems to be a reasonable, peaceful coexistence, if not a mutual support.
Right.
So, I'm a Floridian, and there are many people here on campus who got into Dartmouth through skiing, right, as an athletic pursuit. And as a Floridian, there's not a single slope, right? So you mentioned how DEI is this kind of unfair method for a person to enter an institution. It's kind of like a cheating, right? Would you consider the athletics a similar kind of cheating to enter a college, right? This unfair method that doesn't have much to do with humanities or STEM?
Do you think that the people from Florida have an advantage in swimming over the people from Minnesota?
Possibly.
Okay, well.
But there are lakes in Minnesota.
Okay. Those lakes are only accessible certain times. I used to live in Wisconsin.
Pools, correct?
Yeah, but my point is that there will always be starting conditions for different groups of people that are different. You can make the argument that, and I understand what you did to make the argument about geography, but I would argue that class plays far more of a role than race in that, unless you want to argue that they're overlapping Venn diagrams and people who are African Americans participate in certain socioeconomic classes at higher rates.
That's still a class argument.
It is still a class argument, right. No, I don't. So the bottom line is that you're introducing variables into a system that don't do what the people think that they're going to do.
And perhaps that, you know, if the primary point of college education for most people is signaling, right, that weakens that aspect.
Right. Well, that's also the question: is what's the primary purpose? Is the primary purpose to create diverse outcomes? Is the primary purpose a kind of equity-based argument to remediate injustices of the past? Is the primary purpose, is it a meritocracy? Is it a truth-seeking institution? The answer to your question is, and maybe we'll disagree on this, I don't know, what you think the purpose of the institution is.
This institution?
No, of colleges and universities. I'm just throwing the question out.
Well, maybe not so much on that directly, although I'll think about that. But I do think there is a difference between evaluating college applicants on the basis of how they were born and what they do, right? And so, yeah, I can see plausible reasons why you'd want to admit students who are excellent in various ways. And it doesn't have to be skiing. It could even be, you know, you founded this very influential left-wing social justice group. But if that's what you did, you know, that is a credential that I think helps qualify you for admission. I think that's perfectly legitimate to use those achievements as a basis for admission.
I think it's a difference between hiring me for something because I have somewhere around 25 years of experience in running businesses and hiring me because I'm Jewish. I think it's a merit and accomplishment versus a characteristic that really was largely out of my control, at least from birth, and should not matter in any real way, unless it's like a yeshiva thing or something.
Yeah, but if we're from a libertarian perspective, right, do not private institutions have some right to just to admit people for any criteria that they choose whatsoever?
They have every right. They have every right. Yeah, yeah. A completely private institution that is not receiving taxpayer money is every right.
Okay, so that's the word, completely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's why I said it completely. That is not receiving taxpayer money.
Yes,
Yes,
thank you.
Yeah, no, we can debate whether a public university or a tax-based university has different obligations.
100%. Yes.
That's probably a whole other rabbit hole. Yeah. Question.
What role can alumni play in fixing the mess that you're describing?
Oh, that's a great question. What role can alumni play? So I started a campaign with my nonprofit, Stop Donating to Your Alma Mater. It should literally be the easiest ask in the world. Instead of someone asking you for money, I'm asking you not to donate. Take yourself out to dinner, give it to an animal shelter. That's the number one thing you can do. You can also talk about writing letters. You can talk about, I'll tell you off camera something that just happened to me recently. But that's the number one thing you can do. If you want to make a change, stop donating to your alma mater. Because the schools that I went to, and we spoke about this at lunch, the schools that we went to, they're very, very different places from now than from when. So those kind of financial disincentives can be a motivator.
Yeah. You know, some schools though, right? I mean, Harvard has $50 billion, and they're probably the worst offender. So they can run their school until the sun explodes. Is that even an incentive? Yeah.
Yeah, they're like a university attached to the hedge fund, but even then, Bill Ackerman and others, since the October 7th fiasco, they've seen a massive hit in donations. And the other thing is, we need to work to, again, this is my opinion, we need to work to actively delegitimize these institutions. These are basically nucleation points of madness. And they're spreading divisive, dangerous, toxic, racist propaganda into our society and with our kids in the K through 12 system too. We should at some point, that should be our next panel. But alumni do have a role, so stop donating until the university meets certain minimal criteria.
Well, likewise, those alumni are doing the hiring out of these universities through networks.
Correct. So stop hiring people from Harvard and Yale. Those are the worst offenders. Look at the fires list. Look at fire list. Anybody who makes the top 10, just don't hire them.
And advocate for federal defunding.
Yeah, and then you'll see how quickly, if we get enough people, we'll see how quickly we can make a change.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. Right? Okay. Nathaniel?
So going back to our discussion about free speech and to the extent that it's kind of taken away from us as students, kind of ostracizing other students who have viewpoints that we might not necessarily agree with. In my opinion, I think that the biggest way that the administration can change the school quickly is by changing the students who they admit. So if our goal is to promote more free speech, do we think that we should be admitting students based more off of intellectual diversity who might challenge some of the opinions that are currently at our administration? And if we do go for kind of intellectual diversity, what do you guys view as being good ways to quantify that, besides like maybe race, class, all of these other labels? Because in my opinion, I've always believed that there's a lot more variation between these groups in these groups than there is between the groups.
So you help to explain where the conundrum is going to be. The real question is, because we're not the ones that are going to be deciding that, who is making the arbitrary decision about intellectual diversity, right? We could all probably come to a consensus here because we're all libertarians, ironically, because there's not as much diversity here in terms of opinion, whereas I think you would have a hard time defining that. The beauty of basing it more on some kind of academic, or even, and athletics might be a part of that, or whatever way you can define it, of merit as opposed to some perceived notion of diversity, which has to be arbitrarily defined, and you're going to have a problem doing that. Is that a more useful arbitrary delineation than race or color or religion? Almost certainly. Has every bit as much of the pitfalls? Yeah, I would say so, personally. Again, didn't go to college, but that's just, in general, trying to arbitrarily make a decision typically goes poorly because you're trying to central plan diversity.
I think that economic class is probably one of the biggest indicators of intellectual diversity, and I think it's a really hard argument to make to colleges, even though they say that they're nonprofits, that increasing, the applicants who are low income would be better for the college overall. I also think, like the question, I have $1 million idea now. I'm going to create a test and sell it to all the Ivies, and then if you score one way or the other, then you get accepted. But I think that would be the other thing is, like, do we increase make it not harder, but increase the time that it goes into college applications? Do we ask students to take some sort of test where they respond to different questions? Like, at what point is that part of the application process, and at what point are you going to sit down and say, okay, is this person commie enough to come here or not? I don't know how I would feel about that, and then particularly, I don't know how that would ever be affected at state schools in particular, which is another element to the discussion.
You're also demanding that 18-year-olds all have fairly formed and strong opinions on stuff, which is very problematic.
Okay. We have one final question in the back.
Thank you guys for coming to speak with us. I heard it kind of alluded to that you think it's not the job of the government to restore speech in public life. Well, we're in an era where the people doing the censoring are kind of multinational corporations, big-time organizations. Even Elon Musk, the world's richest man, wasn't powerful enough to bring back free speech on Twitter because of media campaigns and advertising boycotts. Who, if not the government, is powerful enough to restore free speech in public life?
Big tech, we now know, thanks to the Twitter files and Facebook files and X-Files and this thing with the new X-Files, and actually the new X-Files, because they did have a show called The New X-Files, Elon Musk's X-Files, and what's going on in Brazil with a single Supreme Court justice trying to shut down the speech of an entire country. It is the tail wagging the dog. Big tech is being told, you want the regulatory capture that keeps you the only real players in this game and gives you all the market share? Fantastic. You're going to censor and not censor as we wish you will. If we didn't have government agencies that, not just in this country, but around the globe, that were actively trying to impact what can and can't be said on a regular basis, I think you'd have, not only would you have a lot less censorship happening by big tech, you'd have a lot less big tech and a lot more tech. You'd have a lot more companies and options out there. I think we'd still be congealing around a handful of options, but there'd be a lot more people that could end up being one of those handful. And as a result, I don't think you'd see anywhere near the censorship. Anyone that thought that all of the companies were all deciding sometime right around Donald Trump got elected that suddenly political speech was really, really important and we had to protect our democracy by making the Overton window really small and just slightly more to the left. They all decided that at exactly the same time. Anyone who might have thought that was thoroughly disabused of it when all the Facebook files and Twitter files and all of that came out. It's not. The tail was wagging the dog.
All right, with that, I think we're out of time. So thank you all. That,